Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Professor Seth Monahan, and believe it or not, I've got more to say about sequences that go up by step. Today we're going to look at a thing called the rising 5/6 sequence. And to get us off the ground, we're going to listen to what I think is the oldest piece of music I've ever played on this channel. It's from the late 1500s, so a good 2 centuries before Beethoven, and it's a madrigal by the English Renaissance composer John Doland. It's called Come Again, Sweet Love, and as I play you the first stanza, I want you to just listen for a sequence that goes up.
Come again, sweet love doth now invite, thy graces that refrain, to do me due delight, to see, to hear, to touch, his eye, with thee again, his sweetness in thee.
Well, you probably noticed that the sequence is right here, and that it's got a model and 2.5-ish copies. Let's zoom in for a closer look. Now, because the upper voices here are a little leapy, we're going to analyze a sort of smoothed out version, which I'm putting here below the score. And the first thing I want you to notice is that the bass, which I haven't changed, the bass is extremely simple. Like the sequence itself, it just goes up by step. Second, notice that each downbeat is a diatonic triad in root position. The model has 4, and then the copies have 5, 6, and 7 diminished. And that, in turn, leads to tonic. Now, if something sounds a little off here, it's probably because the progression that I just played would never appear in actual Renaissance music. You've got parallel fifths in every bar, and most of them are parallel perfect fifths. Whoops. But Doland, like every composer back then, Doland knows how to get around this, and it's not hard. You just take the voice that makes a fifth above the bass, that's the one on top here, and you just move it up a little early. And that voice that moves early is what gives the sequence its name, because it's easy to see here that in each model and copy, the fifth above the bass becomes a sixth, thus rising 5/6. It's really that simple. The results sound great, and they don't break any rules. And here's Doland's version again. Just a few more points. First, every time that top voice moves, it technically makes a new triad. We could even throw down Roman numerals for each of them. But I'm not going to do that. To me, those aren't, quote, real chords at all. They're just happy accidents of voice leading. Second, I have to admit, I fudged this reduction a bit. This C right here doesn't actually exist. It's a D instead, which makes the whole bar a 5/6 chord. But I did this to make a bigger point. It's extremely common for these sequences to start with scale degree 4 in the bass and then walk upward. But by the time the bass gets to the leading tone, the sequence is usually starting to come apart. It gets a little fuzzy, we might say. That's why I said we had 2.5-ish copies. What matters here is that the sequence peaks with a strong dominant function. And that, in turn, takes us over the top to land on the tonic that caps off the entire phrase. And this, it turns out, is no accident. The musical climax is unmistakably timed to line up pretty much exactly with the point, well, in the poem where... Look, this is a family channel. I can't tell you what the poem is really about.
I've been really trying, baby, trying to hold back this feeling for so long.
Wait, what? Seems like a good time to go back and summarize the basic points. The rising 5/6 is probably the oldest sequence that was still in use in Mozart's time. It gets rarer in the post-Baroque period, but because I'm me, that's where we're going to spend our time today. The sequence itself is built around a chain of root position triads, rising by step, usually in major, and the voice that lies a fifth above the bass avoids parallel fifths by moving up early, so to speak, making a sixth. And while that moving voice technically makes a new harmony, the second sound in each model or copy isn't, as far as we're concerned, a real chord. And finally, the bass of these sequences often rises by step from scale degree 4 up to the leading tone, where we get a chord with a dominant function. But that's also where the sequence tends to unravel or get fuzzy. Okay, so we're ready now to leap forward in time and hear how the composers we normally study use the rising 5/6. Here's a little linking theme from Mozart's A major piano concerto. The sequence turns up at the end, where, as predicted, the bass line rises from scale degree 4 to 7. We'll come back to this in a second. First, though, let's notice how Mozart sets the sequence up. Over the first 4 bars, he gives us 3 statements of this little appoggiatura motive. The first one takes us from 1 to 4 through an applied dominant. Then the next 2 continue to lean into that 5/7 of 4. And when we finally resolve to 4, that's when the sequence gets underway. The bones of the sequence come straight from Doland. We've got root position triads on all 4 downbeats. The big difference is that Mozart just leaves that dominant hanging at the end. We'll hear that in a second. First, though, I want to get under the hood and see how the sequence actually works. In the bottom staff, we've got the 2 voices that make up the 5/6 pattern. And on the top, there's a line moving in parallel tense with the bass. And at this point, we've got all the notes we need. Mozart could have stopped there. But of course he doesn't. He makes the sequence special with that 4th voice, which sends scales tumbling down from each note of the top line. So good. Here's how the whole thing sounds. So, while we're doing piano concertos, let's check in with Beethoven, whose 4th concerto features this gorgeous passage. Now, you should know that the music I'm going to play you is just the beginning of this long build-up that peaks and ebbs and doesn't actually cadence for another full minute. But it all gets off the ground with a rising 5/6. You'll hear it almost immediately. Just listen for that rising bass. So once again, we've got a bass that starts on scale degree 3 and a sequence that walks up from scale degree 4 to the leading tone. And once again, the main chords above 4, 5, and 6 are root position triads. The big difference from the Mozart is that there is no one voice that only does the rising 5/6 thing above the bass. Let's get rid of some of this clutter so we can see what's going on. In the middle system there, we've got the top voice, a 5th above the bass, and then a 6th above the bass, but en route it leaps up to the 10th above the bass. And then the last thing I want to point out here is that, like Mozart and unlike Doland, the dominant at the end here doesn't resolve straight to tonic. But where Mozart just sort of choked the phrase off with a dramatic pause, Beethoven decides to sit on the dominant and ramp up the tension. You can hear it when I play the whole excerpt again. So next up is a passage from the opening of Haydn's Farewell Symphony. By this point in the movement, we've left the tonic F sharp minor, and it seems like we're building up to a big arrival in the relative major A. And during this build-up, Haydn brings in a rising 5/6 to take us over the top. But notice what happens. So I hope you noticed two things. One was a pretty obvious bait and switch. We think the climax is going to be in A major, but then Haydn slams down A minor instead. The other one's a little bit subtler, I guess. It's that, unlike Doland, Mozart, or Beethoven, Haydn has his bass line leaping all over the place. So we should take a second to see how that works. When the track was playing, I gave you a Roman numeral for each model and copy, and they're the same ones we've seen all along, which is to say, root position triads above scale degrees 4, 5, 6, and give or take 7. And in fact, if those bass notes held for the entire bar, the bottom two systems would just give us a standard rising 5-6 pattern. But the model and the copies all have 3 bass notes, actually. In most of them, the bar ends with the original bass note just up an octave. And the note in between is an octave doubling of the note that would have made a 6th with the bass if the bass had stayed in place. So now, strictly speaking, there is no 6th in the upper voices. It's just an octave, which means we don't technically have a 5-6 pattern at all anymore, but it still sounds like one. And it also does the same thing, obviously, which is to rise continuously by step into a strong dominant function. That's probably why Haydn changes the bass line in the last copy with a very cadential sounding octave drop on scale degree 5. And finally, I should warn beginners that this moving bass line can give an even stronger impression that each model and copy contains multiple chords. If we parse this music too literally, we'd actually have 3 root position triads in each sequential unit. We'd have 4, 2, 4, 5, 3, 5, 6, 4, 6, and 7. But that is nonsense. I don't think any sane listener hears 3 chord changes per unit. No, thank you. No, for me, it's 1 harmonic change per bar. See if you agree. Okay, onward. For the next example, we're zigzagging back to the early 18th century for the final chorus of Bach's Easter Oratorio. And the texture here is gnarly enough that I'm going to work from a 3-voice reduction like we did with the Doland. Let's just listen first so you can hear the sequence and notice that the bass line is even busier than Haydn's. So now we're going to build Bach's sequence in stages, starting with that vanilla version under the score. First, we need to subdivide the lower 2 voices into quarter notes. Obviously, that doesn't change anything essential. It's still a rising 5-6. But then we start cutting. Next, we need to get rid of all the notes in the middle voice that lie a 5th above the bass. Those are the ones on beats 1 and 3. Then we want to swap the alto B and the bass D right here, and then do the same on beats 2 and 4 all the way down the line. This gives us a series of attacks that are actually all just a 10th apart. Then we're going to replace those missing alto notes with non-chord tones a step below the top voice. They look like appoggiatures here, but in the original they're actually suspensions made by 2 overlapping lines. Then just before the cadence, we're going to break the sequence, make a 5-7, and resolve it to tonic. So the whole thing sounds like this. And with that in your ears, let's hear the original again. And don't forget to listen for those red suspensions in the trumpets. Our last two examples are going to mix things up just a bit. First, I want to show you a version of the 5/6 called the rising 6/5. For this, we're going to stick with Bach. On screen is a passage from the 6th Goldberg variation, and I want to start just by talking about the texture. Now, you may or may not know that every third Goldberg variation has a canon going on above its bass line. This one has the upper voices built as a canon at the second, meaning that this tune right here comes back one step higher after a 1-bar delay. But the result is that the two upper voices are in a constant tangle, always stepping on each other. Here's what the original looks like. So I decided to notate the passage in 3 staves to make it a little easier to see what's going on. Okay, that being said, let's just start by listening to pinpoint where this sequence is. And here, too, we're going to work from a reduction. And even with just the skeleton of the outer voices, we can see big differences from our other examples. First, the bass uses different notes. Here, we're starting on the leading tone and rising to scale degree 3. That's not always going to happen, but it does here. Next, notice that the downbeats are all parallel sixths. That means they can't be root position triads like we had before. And if we add the middle voice, it's easy to see that every downbeat is actually a 6/3 chord. Now, why are the lower voices notated in 8th notes? Well, it's because each of them moves up by step on beat 2. And when that bass moves up, the 6th against the top voice becomes a 5th. That's the, quote, rising 6/5, and it sounds like this. Now, this is probably obvious, but in case it's not, the rising 6/5 is just a rhythmically shifted version of the 5/6 we already know. It just puts the old downbeat chords on weak beats and vice versa. Let me show you. Here's the sequence, literally note for note, but with the bar lines moved one beat forward. What we get is just a regular old rising 5/6. Anyway, let's get rid of that and customize the rising 6/5 so it's a little closer to Bach's. First, we're going to add sharps to this C and this D, which gives the inner voice a little more juice. And then we're going to add parallel thirds to that inner voice, making every downbeat into a first inversion 7th chord rather than a triad. The results sound like this. And finally, here's Bach's version, but slowed way down so you can really appreciate how beautiful the counterpoint is. Okay, for our last example today, I want to leap way into the future to check in with Robert Schumann, who loves a rising 5/6, especially if he can load it up with crazy dissonances. This is a passage from the song cycle Frauenliebe und Leben, and its text reads, "Stay close to my heart, feel its beating, that I may press you closer and closer." Let's listen first so you can hear the sequence in context. So, what are we dealing with here? Well, we should start by noting that the tonality is a little slippery compared to our other examples. The phrase starts in C major and then ends on 5 of 2 in G major, but the sequence itself sort of lives in a gray area in between them. I'm going to analyze it in C, but don't hold me to that. Now, on the flip side, the texture is refreshingly simple after all that Bach. The bass just walks up from D to F by step. And everything else is just block chords with the 5/6 pattern itself plain as day in the pianist's left hand. And when the right hand adds parallel tenths above the bass, it gives us an off-the-shelf traditional rising 5/6. It also has us coming full circle in a way, because we're kind of ending the lesson where we started. We've got texted music and the sequence underscoring an outpouring of amorous sentiment. But Schumann isn't Doland, and he mods his 5/6 to be way more dissonant than it needs to be. The first thing he does is add a ninth to each downbeat chord, which clashes with the note above and with the bass. And these ninths are weird too, because they're sort of set up like suspensions, but then just never resolve. And then in the second half of each bar, he adds a 12th above the bass, which is actually just a restatement of the left-hand 5th, but then up an octave. And of course, that clashes with the 6th above the bass, which is a 7th below it. So the whole progression with the cadence sounds like this. That's so gorgeous. And here's the recording one more time. One of the things I really like about this Schumann example is that he's able to make the harmony really, really rich without using any chromaticism at all. But I'd say that's the exception rather than the rule. It's much more common to spike these sequences by adding chromatic notes, especially in the bass. So that, shocker, is going to be what we study in the next video, which I will start working on right now.